The fluorescent lights in Meadowbrook Care Home buzzed overhead as I clutched my mobile phone, my hands trembling. "Please, Sarah, just visit him once more," I whispered into the receiver, watching through the window as Dad sat alone in his wheelchair, staring at the same spot on the wall he'd been fixated on for the past hour. "Emma, he doesn't even remember who I am anymore." My sister's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and distant. "What's the point? It's just painful." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the man who once taught me to ride a bicycle, who walked me down the aisle just 5 years ago, now reduced to a shell of confusion and silence. The nursing staff moved around him like he was furniture, efficient, professional, but utterly detached. "He's still our father," I said, my voice breaking. "Even if he doesn't remember, we should remember for him." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Sarah's sigh cut through like a blade. "I can't do this anymore, Emma. I've moved on. You should too." As the call ended, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Henderson, the head nurse, was whispering something to 2 younger staff members while glancing in Dad's direction. Their expressions weren't professional concern. They looked almost annoyed. Dad's lunch tray sat untouched beside him, the food growing cold. When was the last time someone had actually tried to help him eat? My chest tightened as I realized I might be the only person left who still saw him as human. What would you do if your family abandoned someone you loved? Have you ever felt like the only one who cared? 3 weeks passed, and my daily visits became a routine of heartbreak. Each day, I'd find Dad in worse condition, his hair unwashed, his clothes stained, sitting in the same spot for hours. The staff's excuses grew more creative. "He's been difficult today," or "he refused his medication," or my personal favorite, "some residents just prefer to be left alone." But I knew Dad. Even through the fog of dementia, I could see the fear in his eyes when certain staff members approached. Particularly Kevin, a burly care assistant who seemed to take pleasure in handling the residents roughly. I'd watched him grab Dad's arm too tightly, speak to him like he was deaf and stupid. "Your father bit me yesterday," Kevin told me with a smirk that didn't match his supposed injury. "Had to restrain him for everyone's safety." I looked at Dad's gentle hands, now bruised around the wrists, and felt something dark and protective rise in my chest. When I asked to see the incident report, Kevin's smile faltered. "Oh, we're still processing that paperwork." The other families rarely visited. Mrs. Patterson in room 12 hadn't seen her children in 6 months. Mr. Williams' son lived 20 minutes away, but claimed he was too busy with work. The residents who had regular visitors seemed healthier, more alert, better cared for. Those without, well, they faded faster. I started noticing patterns. The residents with involved families got their hair washed, their clothes changed, their medications on time. The abandoned ones like Dad got the bare minimum. It was a 2-tier system, hiding behind professional smiles and cheerful brochures. "He doesn't know you're here anyway," another family member told me in the corridor one day. "Why torture yourself?" But as I sat beside Dad that afternoon, something remarkable happened. When I started humming his favorite wartime song, "We'll Meet Again," his fingers began to tap along. His eyes found mine for just a moment, and I swear I saw recognition flicker there. He might not remember my name, but somewhere deep inside, he knew I was someone who loved him. Have you ever been the only one fighting for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dad had fallen. Again. But this time, something felt different about Mrs. Henderson's voice. Too calm, too practiced, like she'd rehearsed this conversation. "I'm afraid your father took quite a tumble," she said. "Hit his head on the bedside table. We've called the paramedics, but, well, you should probably come immediately." I threw on clothes and raced through empty streets, my mind spiraling. Dad hadn't been walking independently for months. How does someone who can barely stand suddenly fall hard enough to require an ambulance? When I arrived, the paramedics were loading Dad into the ambulance. His face was pale, a nasty gash across his forehead, but what shocked me was his expression. Not confusion, but terror. Pure, primal fear. "What exactly happened?" I demanded, following Mrs. Henderson back inside. "Accidents happen with dementia patients," she said, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. "They become disoriented, try to get out of bed alone." But something caught my eye in Dad's room. His bedside table wasn't where it usually sat. It had been moved closer to the bed, at an odd angle. The water pitcher was on the floor, as if it had been knocked off during a struggle. And strangest of all, Dad's slippers were neatly placed by the door. Impossible if he'd fallen getting out of bed. I was taking photos with my phone when Kevin appeared in the doorway. "Bit late for a photo session, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying a threat that made my skin crawl. "Just documenting the scene," I replied, not backing down. "You know, for insurance purposes." Kevin's face darkened. "Your dad's been getting aggressive lately. Violent even. Sometimes we have to manage difficult residents." The way he said manage made my stomach turn. I looked around the room again, really looked, and saw what I'd missed before. Dad's knuckles were scraped, defensive wounds. The bed sheets were twisted and pulled off the mattress. This wasn't a fall. This was something much worse. As I followed the ambulance to hospital, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions, or next time will be worse." Suddenly, I realized Dad's fear wasn't from dementia confusion. He was afraid because he had every reason to be, and I might be the only person who believed him. How far would you go to protect someone who couldn't speak for themselves? Would you risk everything for the truth? At the hospital, while Dad underwent tests for his head injury, I made a decision that would change everything. I contacted my old university friend, Marcus, who now worked as an investigative journalist for the local paper. Care home abuse cases are notoriously difficult to prove, Marcus told me over coffee the next morning. But if what you're suggesting is true, we need evidence, real evidence. That's when I learned about something called a spy pen, a device that looked like an ordinary writing pen but contained a tiny camera. Within 2 days, I had one hidden in Dad's room, disguised among his personal belongings. What I captured over the next week made my blood run cold. The footage showed Kevin and another staff member, Janet, discussing which residents were problems and which families wouldn't cause trouble. Dad was specifically mentioned as someone whose daughter asked too many questions, but the worst came on day 4 of recording. I watched in horror as Kevin roughly handled Dad during what should have been a routine medication administration, deliberately withholding his pain relief when Dad couldn't understand instructions quickly enough. "Stupid old man," Kevin muttered, just loud enough for the camera to catch. "Family should have put you down by now." The camera also captured something that made my stomach churn. During night shifts, when families were gone and the building was quiet, Kevin would enter residents' rooms and rifle through their personal belongings. He'd pocket small items, watches, jewelry, cash from wallets, items that families would assume were simply lost in the confusion of institutional living. But it wasn't just theft. The footage revealed a culture of systematic neglect and psychological abuse. Staff would deliberately ignore call buttons from residents they deemed difficult. They'd serve meals too hot or too cold, knowing the residents couldn't complain effectively. They'd mock the residents' confusion, making cruel jokes about their mental state. I watched Janet put Dad's dinner just out of reach, then walk away when he couldn't figure out how to access it. Hours later, she'd return and act surprised that he hadn't eaten, writing in his chart that he was refusing meals, grounds for increasing his medication to make him more manageable. I had evidence, but I needed more. That's when I reached out to other families, not the regular visitors, but the ones like Sarah who'd given up. What I discovered was a pattern spanning years. Mrs. Patterson's daughter hadn't just stopped visiting because her mother didn't remember her. She'd stopped after complaining about bruises that staff claimed were from natural falls. When she persisted with questions, Mrs. Henderson had called her in for a family meeting where she was told that her mother was showing signs of agitation whenever she visited. "It's quite common," Mrs. Henderson had explained with practiced sympathy. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to allow our residents to settle into their new reality without the confusion of trying to remember relationships that cause them distress." Mr. Williams's son had been told his father was happier when family didn't upset him with visits. They'd shown him cherry-picked moments when his father seemed calm and content, not mentioning that he'd been heavily sedated to achieve that state. Lisa, whose mother had died at Meadowbrook 6 months earlier, broke down when I spoke to her. "They told me Mom passed peacefully in her sleep," she sobbed. "But now I'm wondering, was she neglected? Did she die because no one was watching over her?" The care home had been systematically isolating vulnerable residents from their families, creating perfect victims with no witnesses. They'd identified which family members were problems, those who asked questions, demanded proper care, or visited too frequently, and had developed sophisticated methods to discourage their involvement. They'd use medical jargon to intimidate families, suggest that dementia patients were better off without the stress of family interactions, and even imply that loving family members were being selfish by insisting on visits that supposedly caused their loved ones distress. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that because Dad couldn't speak for himself anymore, no one would speak for him. They were wrong. As I compiled my evidence, I discovered that Kevin had a history. He'd been dismissed from 2 previous care facilities for disciplinary issues that were never fully documented. Meadowbrook had hired him anyway, desperate for staff and willing to overlook red flags. The system was broken from top to bottom. But now I had proof. Have you ever discovered that the people meant to protect someone were actually the ones causing harm? Have you ever felt like David facing Goliath, fighting an entire system that profits from vulnerability? The day the story broke, I was sitting beside Dad in his new care facility, a place where the staff actually smiled when they saw families arrive, where residents were treated like people instead of problems. Marcus's article, "Hidden Camera Exposes Systematic Abuse at Local Care Home," made front-page news. The footage I'd captured became evidence in a criminal investigation that uncovered years of neglect, financial exploitation, and physical abuse targeting the most vulnerable residents, those without regular family involvement. Kevin and 3 other staff members were arrested. Mrs. Henderson resigned before she could be fired, though she now faces criminal charges. Meadowbrook Care Home's license was suspended pending a full investigation, but the real vindication came when other families started coming forward. The article had opened floodgates of suppressed guilt and long-buried suspicions. Margaret Thompson contacted me within hours of the story breaking, tears streaming down her face as she described how her husband had died at Meadowbrook under suspicious circumstances just 8 months earlier. "They told me he fell down the stairs," she sobbed over the phone. "But Harold was in a wheelchair. He couldn't walk. How does a man in a wheelchair fall downstairs?" I knew something was wrong, but they made me feel like I was being paranoid, like I was a difficult family member causing problems. David Chen called that same evening. His elderly mother had been found with unexplained injuries multiple times at Meadowbrook. "Every time I questioned the bruises, they had explanations ready," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "They said she was combative, that she fought the staff during care routines. But my mother was gentle her whole life. Even with dementia, she wouldn't hurt a fly." The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the horror. Police found evidence of systemic financial abuse. Residents' bank accounts had been systematically drained through forged signatures and fraudulent power of attorney documents. Personal belongings worth thousands of pounds had been stolen and sold. Medications had been withheld or over-administered to make residents more compliant. Most chilling of all, they discovered an informal ranking system among staff. Residents were categorized as greens, those with involved families who visited regularly; yellows, those with some family oversight; and reds, those who were completely isolated. The red residents received substandard care in every area: nutrition, hygiene, medical attention, and basic human dignity. Dad had been marked as a red despite my daily visits, because staff assumed I would eventually give up like most families did. But the most shocking revelation came 3 weeks after the story broke. My phone rang, and Sarah's voice was different, smaller, ashamed. "Emma, I need to tell you something," she said. "I didn't stop visiting because Dad didn't remember me. I stopped because Mrs. Henderson told me that my visits were making his condition worse. She said family presence was agitating him and that the kindest thing would be to let him fade peacefully without the stress of trying to remember us." The conversation that followed broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. Sarah described a calculated campaign of manipulation that had convinced her she was being cruel by continuing to visit Dad. Mrs. Henderson had shown her selective footage of Dad appearing distressed after family visits, not mentioning that he'd been denied his anxiety medication beforehand to create that very reaction. "She made me feel like loving him was hurting him," Sarah whispered. "She said that clinging to relationships he couldn't remember was selfish, that I was traumatizing him every time I walked through that door." I felt a mix of fury and relief. My sister hadn't abandoned Dad out of cruelty. She'd been manipulated by people who wanted free rein to neglect him. They targeted families, I explained. Made us believe that loving our family members was actually hurting them. It was all lies, Sarah. Dad needs us, even if he can't say it. The investigation revealed that this psychological manipulation of families was standard practice at Meadowbrook. Staff had been trained to identify problem families and use their love against them, convincing them that absence was kindness and abandonment was mercy. The legal aftermath was swift and decisive. Kevin received 4 years in prison for assault, theft, and abuse of vulnerable adults. Janet got 2 years for theft and neglect. Mrs. Henderson received 5 years for orchestrating the systematic abuse and financial exploitation. The care home's owners faced massive lawsuits and criminal charges that would ultimately bankrupt the facility. But beyond the legal justice, something beautiful emerged from the darkness. The families who had been driven away began returning to their loved ones. Support groups formed for relatives who had been manipulated into abandonment. New legislation was drafted requiring mandatory family liaison officers and independent oversight of care facilities. Today, 6 months later, Dad sits in the sunny conservatory of his new home, Willowbrook Manor. His physical health has improved dramatically with proper care. While his memory hasn't returned, he's no longer afraid. He smiles when he hears familiar voices, reaches for hands that hold his gently. Sarah visits twice a week now. We take turns reading to him, playing his old records, simply being present. He may not remember our names, but we can see in his eyes that he knows he's loved and safe. The transformation in Dad has been remarkable. At Willowbrook, he participates in music therapy sessions where his fingers still remember how to play simple melodies on the piano. He enjoys art therapy, creating abstract paintings with surprising emotional depth. Most importantly, he laughs, something I hadn't heard him do in months at Meadowbrook. The staff here treat him like the accomplished man he was, a former mathematics teacher who inspired thousands of students, a loving husband and father, a human being deserving of dignity regardless of what he can or cannot remember. Sometimes the most important fight is the one where you're the only person willing to fight. Sometimes protecting someone means protecting them from the very people paid to care for them. And sometimes love means refusing to let go even when everyone tells you to move on. Dad never got his memory back, but he got something more important: his dignity, his safety, and the knowledge that someone would always stand guard over his vulnerable heart. And Sarah got something precious too: the chance to love our father without shame or manipulation, to be present for whatever moments of connection are still possible. The story didn't end with justice served or villains punished. It ended with love restored, with families reunited, with vulnerable people protected. It ended with the understanding that every elderly person, every confused soul, every forgotten resident deserves someone who will fight for them when they can no longer fight for themselves. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? Have you ever felt manipulated into abandoning someone you loved? Your story might help someone else find the courage to speak up, to question authority, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. I read every single comment, and your experiences matter.